This man's life was over. He just didn't know it yet. The year was 1877, and Arthur Prescott was the ghost of his own farm. The Texas sun wasn't a friend here. It was a hammer, beating the life out of his land until it was nothing but cracked lips on a thirsty skull. The wind was a thief, stealing his topsoil by day and whispering his failures into the walls of his empty house by night. He'd come here with a chest full of dreams and a wife, Martha, whose laugh was the only music that ever made sense in this desolate quiet. But he'd buried those dreams right next to her and their baby boy 3 years back, under a skeleton of an oak tree that was the only thing still standing proud on this God-forsaken land. Now silence was his only companion. It sat in Martha's chair. It laid next to him in his cold, empty bed. He was 34 years old, but his soul felt ancient, worn down to a nub by a grief so heavy it might as well have been a mountain on his back. He was a failure. The farm, his marriage, his life. The folks in the town of Redemption, a day's ride away, knew it. He could see the pity in their eyes, and pity was just contempt wearing a Sunday hat. So he stayed put, a living monument to everything he'd ever lost, just waiting for the dirt to finally swallow him whole. And then one evening, as the sun bled all over the horizon, he saw them, silhouettes on the ridge. 7 of them. They weren't cowboys. They moved with a kind of fluid grace, like they were born from the land itself, not just living on it. As they got closer, a cold knot of old fear tightened in his gut. Comanche. He reached for the rifle leaning against his porch, his hand wrapping around the familiar, worn wood. It wasn't an act of aggression. It was the tired reflex of a man who expected the world to deliver only one thing: another beating. The rider in the lead was an old man, his face a roadmap of hard seasons, his long braids decorated with a few simple feathers. His eyes were steady, holding a quiet power that didn't need to be announced. Behind him on their own horses were 6 women, young, old, and in between, all with the same proud, unreadable faces. They didn't look like a war party. They looked like a verdict. They stopped a few dozen yards from his porch. The old man dismounted, his hands open and empty. A sign of peace. Arthur stayed where he was, the rifle held loose, the silence stretching thin between them. "You are Arthur Prescott," the old man said. It wasn't a question. His English was slow, measured, but clear as a bell. Arthur just nodded. "I am Mocha Tavato," the chief said. He gestured to the women behind him. "These are my daughters." The 6 women watched him, their dark eyes taking in every detail of his broken life. The sagging fence, the barn door hanging on by a thread, the tired slump of his own shoulders. "My people's world is shrinking. The buffalo are ghosts. The world you have built is swallowing ours." The chief's gaze moved from Arthur to the cracked, dead fields. It was like he could see right through the dust, into the very soul of the soil. "This land is thirsty," he said, "but it is not dead. There is a hidden spring here, choked by rock. My people know its secrets." Arthur's hand tightened on his rifle. A secret spring? He wanted to laugh. He'd dug, he'd sweated, he'd bled on every single miserable inch of this place. There was no secret spring. There was only dust and failure. As if he could hear Arthur's thoughts, Mocha Tavato said, "You work with the strength of your back, but you work alone. Your spirit is as dry as your well. I have watched you." To be seen in his private misery felt like a violation. It made the hair on his neck stand up. "A man alone cannot make a world," the chief stated, his words hitting Arthur like stones. "But a family can." He paused, letting the silence do the heavy lifting. Then he laid his offer on the table, plain and simple. "I will give you a new life, Arthur Prescott. My daughters will show you the water. They will teach you the plants that wish to grow here. They will make this dead farm live again." Arthur stared, his mind struggling to catch up. A gift like this didn't make sense out here on the frontier. Everything had a price. Everything. "And in return," Arthur finally choked out, his voice rusty from disuse. Mocha Tavato's eyes locked onto his, and Arthur felt like the old man could see every last one of his ghosts. "In return, you will give them sanctuary. You will share this home, and you will choose one of my daughters to be your wife. You will build a family, a bridge between our two dying worlds. The words knocked the wind right out of him. A wife. He was supposed to just choose one? The idea was an insult to Martha's memory, the memory he'd wrapped himself in like a shroud. His first instinct was to scream, to tell them to get off his land, to leave him to his grief. But as he looked past them, at the cracked fields, the leaning barn, the whole pathetic picture of his life, he knew the chief was right. He was already dead. He was just taking a long time to lie down. He looked at the daughters. They weren't just pieces in a bargain. They were women, watching him with a terrifying mix of defiance and maybe even a little fear of their own. He saw life in them, a complicated, frightening, vibrant life that was being offered to him in exchange for his empty silence. He was in a war with himself, between the past he couldn't let go of and a future he couldn't even imagine. What was he protecting, really? The right to be miserable? The freedom to fail in private? A bitter, silent laugh caught in his throat. He was standing on a sinking ship, and this strange old man had just thrown him a rope. "They can stay in the barn," Arthur heard himself say, the words feeling like gravel in his mouth. "For now." Mokotavato nodded slowly, a deep understanding in his ancient eyes. He hadn't won a deal. He'd just witnessed a surrender. He spoke to his daughters in their own tongue, a sound like running water. Their faces didn't change, but one by one, they began to dismount, gathering their things. They moved together, a constellation of sisters, a silent, powerful force that had just invaded his world. Arthur watched them, a stranger on his own property. He had just made a bargain that would either save him or utterly destroy him. The suffocating silence of his life had just been shattered, and he had no idea if the sound that replaced it was the beginning of a song or the tolling of a final bell. The first few days were an exercise in quiet tension. Arthur woke up not to silence, but to the soft murmur of voices from the barn, the smell of a cook fire that wasn't his. He went about his chores, but he felt like he was on a stage. 7 pairs of eyes followed his every move. He suddenly felt loud, clumsy, his every action wasteful and brutish compared to their quiet, seamless efficiency. They spoke in their own language, a river of sound he couldn't understand, creating a world of their own right in his backyard. His house, once his tomb of grief, now felt like a fragile fortress. At night, he'd lock himself inside, the thin wooden door a pathetic barrier against the vibrant life that was blooming just outside its walls. The daughters didn't wait for him to tell them what to do. They weren't guests. They were a force of nature. On the second day, the eldest, Winona, who carried herself like a queen, led her sisters to a rocky, overgrown patch of land Arthur had always ignored. He watched from his porch, his coffee growing cold in his hand. They worked with a patience that seemed almost geological. They cleared brush, their hands moving with a knowledge that seemed older than the dirt itself. Then, using nothing but sharpened sticks in their bare hands, they began to move stones. It was back-breaking work, the kind of labor that had crushed men stronger than him. But they didn't complain. They worked in a silent, perfect rhythm, their low voices a constant hum against the grunts and scrapes of their labor. It was the second eldest, Mesa, who seemed to be the mind behind the muscle. She was quieter than Winona, her face more severe, but her eyes were like chips of obsidian, missing nothing. She saw things he'd never seen, the slight dip in the land, the way a certain kind of weed grew thicker in one spot. She was the one who found it. With a final, coordinated heave, she and 2 of her sisters rolled away a large, flat stone that must have weighed a ton. Beneath it, the earth was dark and damp. A collective sigh of satisfaction went through the group. Arthur felt a jolt, a mixture of disbelief and a hot, creeping shame. He put his cup down and walked over, compelled to see it with his own eyes. He had walked this land 1,000 times, cursed it 1,000 times, and had seen nothing but death. They had been here for 2 days, and they had found its heart. Mesa looked up at him, her face smudged with dirt, her expression completely unreadable. She just gestured to the damp soil. There was no triumph in her eyes, just a simple, undeniable fact. For the next week they dug. Arthur, moved by a strange, reluctant mix of duty and shame, eventually grabbed his own shovel and joined them. His tools felt loud and crude next to their methods. At first they all worked in a tense, thick silence, broken only by the scrape of his shovel against rock. He could feel them watching him, judging him. He was the white man, the symbol of the world that was slowly erasing theirs. But slowly something began to shift. It wasn't a friendship, not yet. It was a truce, built not on words but on shared sweat and aching muscles. The youngest, a girl named Neva, with a spark of life in her eyes, stumbled while carrying a heavy rock. On pure instinct, Arthur lunged forward and caught her, steadying the stone before it could crush her foot. She looked at him with wide, startled eyes, murmured something in her own tongue, and then scurried away. But later that day, as they rested in the sliver of shade cast by the barn, another sister, the quiet and shy Sotea, silently held out a piece of dried meat to him. It was a small gesture, but in the silent world they shared, it felt massive. He took it with a nod, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of something other than loneliness. The water didn't burst forth in a great flood. It was a slow, patient seep, a quiet welling from deep within the earth. But it was there. It was real. Mesa then orchestrated the digging of narrow, intricate channels, guiding the precious water toward the parched fields with the precision of an artist. She read the contours of the land, coaxing the water along paths it seemed to want to follow. Arthur watched, humbled. He had tried to force life from this land with a plow and a prayer. They were whispering it back into existence. But the bargain was always there, hanging over them like a hawk. Choose a wife. The thought was a constant, unsettling hum in the back of his mind. How could he possibly choose? They were 6 parts of a single, functioning whole. Winona, the stoic leader; Mesa, the quiet strategist; Istas, fierce and watchful; Va-Vi-Na, whose hands were never still, always mending or weaving; So-Tia, gentle and observant; and Neva, whose bright, youthful energy was a splash of color in his gray world. To choose one felt like it would be breaking them all apart. He found himself watching Mesa the most. There was a stillness to her, a deep well of thought behind her dark eyes. She rarely spoke to him, but he often felt her gaze on him as he worked, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle. One evening he found her standing by Martha's grave. The crude wooden cross he had carved was leaning, beaten by the wind. Mesa had placed a single small purple wildflower at its base. She wasn't praying, she was just acknowledging. Acknowledging the grief that radiated from that small patch of earth, like heat from a stove. He walked over slowly. "That was my wife," he said, his voice feeling rough in his throat. "Martha." Mesa didn't turn. "It is a lonely place to be," she said softly, her English as careful and deliberate as her father's. "She wasn't from here," Arthur found himself saying, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "She loved green hills, trees. I brought her to this." The guilt was a fresh, sharp stab. "You brought her to where your hope was," Mesa corrected him gently. "Hope is not a place. It is a seed. Sometimes it needs different soil to grow." They stood there in a long, shared silence, the air between them suddenly full of the unspoken weight of their different losses. It was the first real conversation they had ever had, a tiny, fragile bridge built across a vast canyon of culture and sorrow. When he went back to the house that night, the silence inside felt different. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating weight of absence anymore. It was just quiet. He was still alone in the house, but for the first time in 3 years, he didn't feel completely alone in the world. He had no idea that the hope Mesa spoke of was about to be put to the test. And the different soil she mentioned, it was about to be watered with blood. As weeks turned into a month, the farm was reborn. The patch of land by the new spring exploded with life. The sisters planted corn, squash, and beans, a trio they called the Three Sisters, which nourished the soil as they grew. They showed him wild plants he'd always dismissed as weeds, explaining their uses as medicine or food. The drafty old barn was now organized and clean, a shared space between his animals and the women's living quarters. Even the house began to change. One day he walked in from the fields to find the worn kitchen table scrubbed clean, with a small pot of the same purple wildflowers from the grave sitting in the center. He started eating his meals with them. At first it was awkward. He'd sit on his porch steps while they sat by their fire. Then one night, Vaina, the quiet weaver, brought him a bowl of savory stew without a word. The next night he moved his chair a little closer. Soon he was sitting right there with them, sharing their food, listening to the musical rise and fall of their language, even starting to pick out a word here and there. He was learning their names, their individual laughs. He was watching a family be a family, and with a slow, creeping terror, he realized he was becoming part of it. The choice of a wife was still a cloud on the horizon, but its shape was changing. It wasn't about which one he would take anymore. It was about who he was connecting with. His conversations with Mesa became a quiet, nightly ritual. They spoke of the land, the stars. She told him the Comanche names for the constellations, stories of the trickster coyote and the noble eagle. He, in turn, told her about his father's farm back in Ohio, a place so impossibly green it felt like a dream he'd once had. He found himself wanting to know what she thought about everything. He was starting to see the world through her wise, steady eyes. He wasn't falling in love, not in the way he had with Martha, which had been like a lightning strike. This was slower, quieter, like the patient seep of the spring they had uncovered. It was a respect and admiration, a deep, soul-shaking tenderness that was growing in a place he thought was barren forever. But trouble, you see, doesn't always announce itself with thunder. Sometimes it seeps in like a poison. Word of Arthur's arrangement had reached redemption. When he rode in for supplies, the air was suddenly colder. Men who used to give him a curt nod now turned their backs. The store owner, Mr. Callahan, served him with a sour look on his face, his eyes darting around as if he were afraid of being seen talking to him. "Heard you got yourself some company, Prescott," Callahan muttered, his disdain dripping from every word. "Living out there with a whole pack of savages." The word savages hit Arthur like a physical blow. He looked at Callahan's pinched, pale face and saw the raw, ugly face of a fear he didn't understand. These were the same men who had pitied him when he was failing. Now that his farm was showing signs of life, tended by hands they didn't recognize, their pity had curdled into contempt. "They are my guests," Arthur said, his voice dangerously low. He grabbed his supplies and walked out, the hostile silence of the town pressing in on his back. He was starting to realize the bargain wasn't just about the farm, it was about choosing a side. And the other side had a leader, a man named Elias Vance. Vance was a rancher whose sprawling property bordered Arthur's own. He was a man who saw the world in terms of what he could own and what he could crush. For years he'd coveted Arthur's land, not for the soil, but for the creek that ran along its southern edge. He'd always seen Arthur as a sad, broken man who would eventually starve or drink himself to death, leaving the land ripe for the picking. But now Arthur wasn't failing anymore. A friendly blacksmith pulled Arthur aside on his next trip to town. "It's Vance," he whispered. "He's telling everyone you've lost your mind. Says those Comanche women are witches, that they've put a spell on you to get the land. People are scared, Arthur. And Vance, he knows how to use fear like a weapon." The fear wasn't just talk. A few days later, he found a dead snake coiled on his gatepost. Then the word heathen was scrawled in black charcoal across his barn door. He scrubbed it off before the sisters could see it, but the ugliness of it lingered in the air, a foul smell you couldn't get rid of. A fierce, protective anger began to burn in his chest, an emotion he hadn't felt since Martha died. These women had honored their bargain. They had brought his world back from the dead. The idea of anyone harming them because of him was a thought he couldn't tolerate. He tried to shield them from it, but they saw it. They saw the new tension in his shoulders when he came back from town, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon. One evening, as he was reinforcing the barn door, Mesa came to him. "The town," she said. It wasn't a question. "They do not like that we are here." Arthur stopped hammering. He looked at the quiet strength in her face. There was no fear there, just a deep, knowing sadness. "They are fools," he said, the word feeling weak and useless. "They are men who fear what is different," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "My father knew this would not be easy. A bridge must have strong foundations on both sides of the river, or it will be washed away in the first storm." The storm was coming, He could feel it in the air. Vance, emboldened by the town's silence, started riding his men along the fence line, their presence a constant, silent threat. They would just sit on their horses and watch the sisters work in the fields, their leering eyes a violation of the fragile peace Arthur's farm had become. Arthur rode out to meet them once, his heart pounding in his chest. "This is my land, Vance," Arthur said, trying to keep his voice from shaking. "You have no business here." Vance, a big man with a cruel smile and eyes as cold as a winter river, just laughed. "Your land, Prescott, looks more like a Comanche camp to me. I'm just making sure my cattle don't wander into the wrong company." His men snickered. "You best send them back where they came from before there's real trouble. Some folks are starting to think that land ought to belong to a white man who knows what to do with it." The threat was crystal clear. This wasn't just about prejudice anymore. It was about greed. Vance wanted the land, and he was using the sisters as his excuse to take it. The final straw came a week later. Arthur woke up to find the narrow irrigation channel from the spring deliberately dammed with rocks and mud, choking off the lifeblood of their new crops. It was a cruel, calculated attack, aimed right at the heart of their hard work. He and the sisters spent the entire day under the brutal sun, clearing the blockage, their shared, silent anger a stronger bond than any words. As they worked, he saw the fire in Istis's eyes, the grim set of Winona's jaw. They weren't helpless victims. They were warriors, ready to defend what they had built. That night, Arthur didn't go to sleep. He sat on the porch, his rifle across his lap, watching the moonlit prairie. This wasn't just a piece of property anymore. It was a home, a sanctuary, the place where Mesa had taught him the names of the stars. He was no longer just defending 6 women. He was defending the tiny, flickering flame of hope they had lit inside of him. The bridge Mesa had spoken of was about to face its storm, and Arthur knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would not let it be washed away. He would be its foundation, no matter the cost. But there was another secret, buried deeper than the spring. A secret about Vance and about Martha's grave that was about to change everything. Arthur thought this fight was about land. He had no idea it was about a murder. Arthur started to put the pieces together, and the picture they formed was horrifying. He remembered how, just weeks after Martha's funeral, Elias Vance had come knocking. At the time, Arthur had been so lost in his own fog of grief that it barely registered. Vance had been polite, even sympathetic, talking about the burdens of a big farm for a man alone. He'd made a lowball offer for the land, mumbling something about taking it off your hands as a favor. Arthur had thrown him out, his grief turning to a flash of white-hot rage. Now that memory felt different. It felt predatory. Vance hadn't been offering a kindness. He'd been circling like a vulture. He started thinking about Martha's death. The official story was simple, tragic. Her horse, a normally gentle mare, had spooked while she was riding near the eastern fence line. The fence line she shared with Vance's property. She'd been thrown, her head striking a rock. A terrible accident. That's what the sheriff had said. That's what everyone had said. But now tiny, nagging details started to surface from the depths of his memory. He remembered finding a piece of torn burlap snagged on the barbed wire right where she fell, something he'd dismissed at the time. He remembered one of Vance's ranch hands riding away from that area just an hour before he found her. Coincidences. Just tragic, meaningless coincidences. Or were they? The thought was so monstrous he could barely let it form in his mind. But it wouldn't let him go. He went into the house, into the bedroom that still smelled faintly of her, and pulled out the small wooden chest where he kept the few things he had left of her. A lock of her hair, a book of poems she loved, and her journal. He'd never been able to bring himself to read it. It was too painful. Now, his hands shaking, he opened it. He read for hours, the fading sunlight giving way to the dim glow of an oil lamp. It was mostly simple things. Notes about the garden she was trying to grow, her loneliness, her hopes for their child. But then he found it. The entries from the last month of her life. October 12th. Mr. Vance was near the creek again today. He says he is looking for stray cattle, but he just watches the house. It makes my skin crawl. He has such cold eyes. October 19th. Arthur was in town for supplies. I saw Mr. Vance ride onto our property. He did not see me in the garden. He was looking at the old oak and the rocky patch behind it. He had a shovel. When he saw me, he smiled a strange smile and said he was just admiring the view. I felt a chill all over. October 25th. I told Arthur about Mr. Vance. He said he's just a greedy man who wants our water. Not to worry. But I am worried. There is a darkness in that man, a hunger. The last entry was dated 2 days before she died. November the 2nd. I heard a noise from the barn last night. When I looked out, I saw a man ride away, back toward the Vance property. This morning I found Daisy, my mare, spooked in her stall, her eyes wide with fear. There was a strange, sweet smell on the burlap sack by her feed. Something is wrong, I am afraid. Arthur dropped the journal as if it were on fire. The torn burlap on the fence. The spooked horse. The sweet smell. Had Vance's man drugged the horse? Set her up to bolt at the slightest sound? It wasn't just a theory anymore. It was a cold, hard certainty that settled in his gut like a block of ice. Elias Vance hadn't just been waiting for him to fail. He'd ensured it. He had murdered Martha for this piece of land. He walked out of the house, the journal clutched in his hand, his mind a maelstrom of grief and a rage so pure and cold, it felt like it could freeze the sun. He found Mesa by the spring, watching the new moon rise. He didn't have to say a word. She looked at his face, at the book in his hand, and she knew. It wasn't just the land, he said, his voice a raw whisper. He wanted her gone. Mesa listened as he told her everything. She listened with that deep, unnerving stillness of hers. When he was done, she didn't offer empty words of comfort. She simply reached out and placed her hand on the journal. My people have a story, she said softly, her voice a balm on his raw soul, about a man so greedy he tried to steal the moon from the sky. He failed, and for his crime, he was cursed to spend eternity in darkness, always seeing the light but never able to touch it. She looked from the journal to the dark line of Vance's property on the horizon. This man Vance, he did not just try to steal your land. He tried to steal your son. The darkness is coming for him now. And in that moment, Arthur's mission became terrifyingly clear. This wasn't about defending a farm anymore. It wasn't about prejudice or greed. This was about justice. This was about vengeance. He looked at Mesa, and their alliance was sealed. They were no longer just a farmer and a chief's daughter. They were partners in a war that had started with a whisper in a journal and would only end in blood and thunder. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, threatening a storm that wouldn't break when Vance and his men finally made their move. There were 5 of them this time, and they didn't stop at the fence line. They rode right onto Arthur's land, their horses deliberately trampling the new green shoots of corn that stood as a testament to the sisters' hard work. It was a calculated act of destruction, a final, arrogant insult. They carried rifles, and they carried the smug confidence of bullies who believe numbers and malice make them right. But Arthur was expecting them. He stepped off the porch, his own rifle held at his side, not aiming, but ready. He had told the sisters to stay inside, to lock the door. This was his fight, his sin to atone for. He had brought this ugliness to their doorstep, and he would be the one to face it. Prescott, Vance called out, his voice full of mock joviality. He pulled his horse to a halt, and his men fanned out behind him in a menacing crescent. We've come to help you clean up this little mess. The good people of Redemption are tired of having this filth so close to town. This is my home, Elias, Arthur said, his voice calm and steady, carrying clearly in the tense, heavy air. These women are under my protection. Turn your horses around and leave. Vance let out a harsh, grating laugh. Your protection? You're one man, Prescott, a broken-down farmer who couldn't even keep his own wife alive. The words were meant to be poison darts, meant to shatter his nerve. And they stung. The old ghost of his failure with Martha rose up, threatening to choke him. But then a new fire burned it away. The image of Mesa placing a flower on that grave. The sound of Neva's laughter. The taste of the stew Va-Vi-Na had shared. He was not that man anymore. They had changed him. They had forged him into something new. I said leave, Arthur repeated, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. He raised the rifle, the barrel now level with Vance's chest. For a split second, surprise flickered in Vance's cold eyes. He had expected the broken man. He hadn't expected this quiet pillar of iron defiance. He sneered, his bravado returning. You and what army? He nodded to one of his men, a lanky goon with a torch already lit. Burn the barn. Let's smoke these rats out. The man started to dismount, the flame of the torch dancing hungrily. A wave of helpless fury washed over Arthur. He was one man. He couldn't stop them all. He could take Vance, but the others would burn everything to the ground. But before the man's boot even touched the dirt, the front door of the house flew open with a resounding crack, and it was not a picture of cowering, helpless victims that greeted them. The six sisters emerged, standing shoulder to shoulder on the porch, a silent, formidable line of defiance. They had not been hiding. They had been preparing. Winona and Istas stood at the ends, each holding a drawn bow, an arrow nocked and aimed with lethal steadiness. Vavi-Na and Sotia held heavy, sharpened farming tools, a hoe and a sickle, not like tools but like battle axes. Neba, the youngest, held a length of heavy chain, swinging it slowly and menacingly in her hand. And at the forefront, standing slightly in front of the others, was Mesa. She held no weapon. Her hands were empty. Her power was in her gaze, a gaze fixed on Vance with an intensity that burned hotter than his torch. Vance and his men froze, their sneers faltering. This was not the scenario they had imagined. They had come to terrorize a lone man and a group of savages. They were met with a united front, an image of unexpected and deadly strength. The man with the torch hesitated, looking to Vance for his next order. I will not say it again, Mesa's voice rang out, clear and sharp as flint. This is our home. You are not welcome here. The standoff was absolute. The air crackled with a tension so thick you could taste it. It was 5 men with rifles against 1 man, 2 bows, and a wall of unbreakable will. Vance, enraged, humiliated in front of his men, began to raise his own rifle, his face twisting into a mask of pure fury. He was going to force the issue, to spill blood just to save his pathetic pride. But at that exact moment, a new sound cut through the charged silence. It was the thunder of hooves, a lot of hooves. And they weren't coming from the direction of the town. They were coming from the west, from the open prairie. Over the rise, a line of riders appeared, their forms growing larger and more distinct with every powerful stride. At the lead was Mocha Tavado, and he was not alone. Behind him rode at least a dozen Comanche warriors, their faces painted for battle, their presence radiating a raw, ancient power that made Vance's small gang of bullies look like children playing with toys. They didn't charge. They didn't shout. They simply arrived. They formed a silent, imposing line behind Arthur and the sisters, a living wall of retribution, the physical manifestation of the promise the chief had made. Mocha Tavado guided his horse forward until he was beside Arthur. His gaze fell upon Vance, and it held the weight of 1,000 years of judgment. Vance's face went white. The color drained from his men's faces as they suddenly found themselves hopelessly, terrifyingly outnumbered, caught between a farmer who would not break, a house of women who would not bend, and a war party that seemed to have materialized from the very earth itself. This man, Arthur Prescott, is my son, Mocha Tavado said, his voice calm, but resonating with an authority that shook the very air. These women are my daughters. This land is their home. He paused, his eyes narrowing on Vance. You have mistaken a bridge for a battlefield. There will be no battle here. You will leave now. There was no room for argument. The threat was unspoken, but absolute. Vance, defeated not by a single shot, but by an unshakable wall of solidarity, sputtered for a moment, then yanked his horse's rein so hard the animal reared in protest. He cast one last look of pure, venomous hatred at Arthur, before spurring his horse into a frantic, cowardly retreat. His men scrambled to follow, their flight a chaotic, pathetic spectacle. The silence they left behind was profound. The storm had passed as quickly as it had arrived. Arthur slowly lowered his rifle, his entire body trembling with the adrenaline of the confrontation. He looked at Mesa, who was still standing on the porch, her eyes on him. And in that one shared gaze, everything fell into place. The bargain, the work, the fear, the discovery, the vengeance. It had all led to this single moment of absolute clarity. He was no longer just a man who had accepted an offer. He was a man who had chosen a family, and who had been chosen in return. He turned to Mocha Tavato, his heart so full of a gratitude too deep for words. The old chief simply looked at him, then at Mesa, and a slow, profound look of satisfaction settled on his face. He had not given his daughters away. He had planted a new garden in a new land, and he had just witnessed its first, defiant, beautiful bloom. Arthur walked toward the porch, toward Mesa, his steps sure and certain for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The choice was no longer a burden, it was a destination, and he had finally arrived. In the quiet aftermath, as the dust settled and Mocha Tavato's warriors stood like silent, watchful statues on the perimeter of the farm, a new world was born. The violent confrontation hadn't shattered them. It had forged them. It had burned away the last lingering traces of doubt and suspicion, leaving behind the pure, unbreakable steel of their bond. That evening, Arthur didn't retreat into the lonely silence of his house. He sat with Mocha Tavato and the sisters around their fire, the flames casting a warm, living light on their faces. The warriors kept a respectful distance, their presence a comforting blanket of security, a guarantee that the peace they had won was real and would be protected. Later, after the chief had gone to join his men for the night, Arthur found Mesa standing by the spring they had unearthed together. The water trickled softly, a gentle music that was now the heartbeat of their revitalized land. The moon was a high, bright sliver in the dark sky, turning the landscape silver and catching in her dark, braided hair. "Your father," Arthur began, his voice still holding a trace of awe. "He came." Mesa turned to face him, and her gaze was soft in the moonlight. "He did not need to," she said. "You were enough. We were enough. But a father's heart is a restless thing." He looked at her, at the incredible strength and quiet grace that seemed to radiate from her like warmth from a fire. He thought back to the preposterous bargain her father had offered what felt like a lifetime ago. It wasn't preposterous anymore. It was the foundation of his entire world. And the one part of that bargain that had once terrified him the most now seemed like the most natural, the most necessary thing he could possibly imagine. "The offer your father made," Arthur said, his own heart finding a new, steady rhythm in his chest. "It had conditions, a sanctuary, a share of the harvest, and a wife." He took a step closer, his hands finding hers. They were strong, capable hands that knew the earth, that had mended and built, and when needed, had been ready to fight. Mesa's expression became guarded, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. "I know," she said quietly. "That is not a condition I can meet," Arthur said, and he saw the brief, sharp flash of hurt cross her face before he could continue. "A wife is not a condition of a bargain," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. "She is a partner, a choice made by the heart. The bargain your father offered is fulfilled. The farm is alive. You have your sanctuary." He paused, gathering every last ounce of his courage, looking into the eyes of the woman who had shown him how to live again. "I am asking you, Mesa, daughter of Mocha Tavato, not as part of any deal, but because my world makes no sense without you in it. Will you be my wife?" A slow, beautiful smile spread across her face, chasing away the last of the shadows. It was the first time he had ever seen her truly, fully smile, and it was like watching the sun rise after a long, dark night. "Arthur Prescott," she said softly, her fingers tightening around his. "My heart has been waiting for you to ask." Their wedding wasn't held in a stuffy church with a priest droning on. It was a simple ceremony, held right there under the vast Texas sky, beside the life-giving spring. Mocha Devato officiated, his words a blend of Comanche blessings for the earth and sky, and a simple acknowledgement of the bond between two people, two cultures, two souls who had found each other in the dust. Her sisters stood with her, their faces beaming, their acceptance of him now complete and unconditional. They were his sisters now too, his family. In the years that followed, the Prescott farm flourished. It became an oasis of impossible life in the harsh prairie, a testament to what could grow when different kinds of knowledge were allowed to braid together. Arthur taught them the crop rotation he'd learned back in Ohio. They taught him about dry farming and how to read the moods of the temperamental Texas seasons. The farmhouse, once a hollow shell of grief, was now filled with life, with the sounds of laughter. The scent of roasting corn and savory stews mingled with the smell of baking bread. The quiet melody of Comanche lullabies for their children blended with the English stories Arthur would read aloud by the fire in the evenings. Elias Vance was never seen again. The story of his public humiliation and of the silent, formidable power that protected the Prescott farm spread through the county like wildfire. Some said he just packed up and left in the night, unable to bear the shame. Others whispered that he'd ridden out into the prairie and had been swallowed by the land itself, a final payment on the blood debt his family owed. Fear of the Prescott farm slowly gave way to a grudging respect, and eventually to a weary curiosity as people saw that it was not a place of witchcraft, but of miraculous abundance. Arthur Prescott's life had been given back to him, just as the chief had promised. But it wasn't the bargain that had saved him. It was the choice to accept it. The choice to accept help, to accept a different way of seeing the world, and to accept a love he never ever expected to find again. He had started as a man drowning in the dust of his own sorrow, on a farm that was nothing but a grave for his dreams. But the arrival of a wise old chief and his 6 daughters had been like a cleansing rain on a parched and broken land. They hadn't just saved his farm, they had saved him. They had taught him that a home isn't a place you find, it's a thing you build. It's a garden you tend together, watering it with respect, nurturing it with kindness, and building a bridge strong enough to weather any storm, with foundations planted deep in the rich, fertile soil of the human heart. If you believe that family is something you build, not something you're just born into, then do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to ring the bell so you don't miss another story. Thanks for watching.